Okay, so good afternoon. Let us begin our discussion on T.S. Eliot's tradition and individual talent. Today, we will be discussing part one of this very important essay. Uh, the title of the essay, as we all know, is Tradition and Individual Talent, and this essay came out in 1919. I have already pointed out that most of the critical work of T.S. Eliot is, in fact, a justification of his poetry. We can say that what is being argued in this essay called Tradition and Individual Talent can be seen being put in practice, being put into practice in his poems like The Wasteland and uh, Love Song of Alfred J. Woodrow. So, most of the things which are argued in his critical works are a justification of his poetic style, of his poetic work, of his poetry. There are four or five things which we can say are important as far as the first part of tradition and individual talent are concerned. One is his initial comments on the neglect of tradition in English tradition of literature. I will repeat, neglect of tradition in the English tradition of the reading and writing of literature. Let us begin with this, then we will come to the next point. In English writing, we seldom speak of tradition, though we occasionally apply its name in deploring its absence. We cannot refer to the tradition or to a tradition at most. We employ the adjective in saying that poetry of so and so is traditional or even too traditional. So, in English writing, we seldom speak of tradition. It simply means that in English writing, the concept of tradition has never been important. This brings us to our first point, which will be elaborated in the next few statements that we will be reading from this essay. That in the English tradition of literature, there is greater emphasis on uniqueness than on common aspects of a shared tradition. I am repeating myself. That absence of tradition implies that in the English tradition of literature, there is greater emphasis on uniqueness than on the common aspects of the shared tradition of writing. Certainly, uh, okay, so today we'll be discussing Tradition and Individual Talent by T.S. Eliot. This is a 1919 essay, and it has been considered to be a very important contribution to criticism. It will be pertinent to point out right at the beginning that most of the critical work of T.S. Eliot is in fact a justification of his poetic creed. So what is argued in this essay is put into practice in the poems of T.S. Eliot. But that does not mean that the ideas are not important. The ideas are in themselves immensely important, and they have been applied to poetry for a very long time, and they have contributed to our understanding of both criticism and poetry. So, as the title suggests, the essay is about two things. One is tradition, the second is individual talent. The essay begins with T.S. Eliot commenting on the absence of tradition or the absence of the concept of tradition in English literature. The very first line of the essay reads, in English writing, we seldom speak of tradition, which means that in the interpretation of literature, as far as the English tradition of literature is concerned, tradition has never been important. Now, if we look at the term from a layman's point of view, tradition is linked both with the past and with the sense of continuity. So when he says in English writing, we seldom speak of tradition, he seems to mean that as far as English literature is concerned, as far as the interpretation of English literature is concerned, neither the past nor a sense of continuity seems to be important, because he says that such notions as the tradition, a tradition, are never used in a positive way. If at all the term traditional is made use of, it is either used pejoratively, that means negatively, to say that the work, that a given piece of work is very traditional and lacks novelty. Okay? And if at all this word is used positively, okay, it is used for archaeological reconstructions, when something dead from the historical past is brought back to life and provides some new knowledge related with the historical past. So this is the beginning of this essay. I will just repeat what I have said. He deplores the absence of tradition. He comments on the absence of tradition in the English system of literature. Okay? We can equate thus far, okay, at this stage, although we will be exploring with the help of T.S. Eliot the idea of tradition in a greater detail, but initially we may link the term tradition with a sense of past and with a sense of continuity. So T.S. Eliot at the beginning suggests that English literature, in English literature, emphasis is not placed on either the past or on a sense of continuity. So where is the emphasis placed? The emphasis is placed on uniqueness of a work of art, not on the shared attributes of all the writers. See, we can, make these terms clear to ourselves by reminding ourselves of the title, Title is Tradition and Individual Talent. There are actually two things with the help of which we can approach a piece of work. Okay? One is the uniqueness of a writer or the uniqueness of a work. What is new in it? On the other hand, we can interpret the work in connection with the presence of those shared attributes which are not only present in the other writers who have written in the past, but which remind you of a past, a tradition, and a continuity. Okay. So he says, as far as English literature is concerned, individuality is more important, has been more important than tradition. Certainly, the word is not likely to appear in our appreciations of living or dead writers. He says, certainly, this word remains absent in our appreciation of literary works. Okay? And this is an attribute which is peculiar as far as English literature is concerned, because he says every nation, every race has not only its own creative, but its own critical turn of mind. Every nation has its own sense of creativity. Every nation, every people has its own system of criticism. And as far as the English system of criticism is concerned, there is hardly any importance placed on tradition, on a sense of past, on a sense of continuity. This is an attribute which is or which differentiates English literature from the French literature. Okay? Because a little later, he goes on to say that as far as this aspect of literary practice is concerned, French are different. French are more critical than we. French are more critical than we. They have a much more rich tradition of criticism. They have a deeper sense of their literary traditions, their literary past. They do not approach a work of art as an example of a writer's uniqueness. Rather, they try and receive a work, they try and understand a work of literature by placing it in the tradition of writing. So their critical faculties are more developed than the critical faculties of English critics. This is his second point. Let me read a bit. Perhaps they are, but we might remind ourselves that criticism is as inevitable as breathing, and that we should be none the worse for articulating what passes in our minds when we read a book and feel an emotion about it. We should not take pride, he says, that the English critics, English thinkers, should not indulge in a kind of reading where criticism or a critical appraisal of a work is not considered to be important, and exclusive attention is paid only to What is new in this work? What is unique in this work? What makes this work entirely new? It says this is a tendency which should be corrected because criticism has its own importance. We should learn from the French to sharpen our critical faculties. This is his second point. One of the facts that might come to light in this process is our tendency to insist when we praise a poet upon those aspects of his work in which he least resembles anyone else. In English, in English literature, as far as the English critics and thinkers are concerned, as far as common English readers are concerned, it is common among them to dwell on those aspects of a work in which the writer least resembles anyone else. This is what I was referring to when I use the terms uniqueness of a work and the shared attributes with the other writers. There are things, as I said, there are things which are common and there are things which are unique to a work. As far as English tradition is concerned, there is an imbalance. There is a disproportionate attention to what is new, what is unique. I will come back to this point after we have read a bit more. We dwell with satisfaction upon the poet's difference from his predecessors, especially his immediate predecessors. We endeavor to find something that can be isolated in order to be enjoyed. So in English literature, okay, poets and writers are often praised for being unlike their predecessors. Whereas if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best, but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. Now, this is a very important statement. We can even say that this is a point in the essay where we need to remind ourselves about a few things. One is, after all, how does Eliot approach literature? After having understood that he objects to the absence of tradition in English writing, that he deplores the absence of tradition, he believes that English thinkers, critics, common readers need to amend the way they approach a work. System of appraisal should change. There should be an equally potent and strong sense of the past and a sense of continuity, which he calls tradition, as there is a sense of individuality. After having understood these basic things, we need to ask ourselves, why is he saying all this? This can be linked with a very important assumption which seems to lie at the back of all these arguments. What is that assumption? The assumption is that after all, if we consider literature to be a very important part of culture, it is a collective response to experience, just like the other aspects of our cultural life are. Our conceptions of our conceptions related to our social life, our food, our dress, our gods and goddesses, ideological conceptions. They are not a matter of individual thinking. Rather, They are all a result of the shared experience. Similarly, literature is also an outcome of shared experience of a people, of a society. So, if literature is an outcome of shared experience, how can we have, how can we give disproportionate attention to the individual aspects? Okay. Now, if we draw an analogy and imagine that we are writing a theory on the dressing habits of a society, we will be entirely misguided if we pay attention to a person's, an individual's sense of dressing, while at the same time ignoring the common and shared, traits which are to be found in the dress of everyone around in a particular place. So, just to repeat myself, all these arguments should be placed against an assumption that literature, like other aspects of our cultural life, like other conceptions of our cultural life, is an outcome of shared experiences, is an outcome of our shared response to life. So definitely, even if there are some individual aspects, elements, properties, characteristics in a work, it must also contain so many things which are common in the works of all the writers that have existed before a certain point in. The next point, which is equally important, is that in Eliot's view, tradition is not static. Tradition is dynamic. This is the second. One, every good critic should have a sense of tradition. This we have already discussed. Second, tradition can never be thought to be static. There is no definitive end to the evolution of tradition. It continues to alter. But there is another very important point which is made in the next paragraph. What is that? One, he says that, now, what is tradition according to T.S. Eliot? Now, let me first make this clear. Tradition, I may have hinted at it also. Tradition for T.S. Eliot is a historical sense. It's a historical sense of the literature which existed or has existed before a point of time. Only after acquiring a historical sense can one hope to become a good. A blind adherence or an imitation of earlier writers will not take you far. Yet, if the only form of tradition of handing down consisted in following the ways of the immediate generation before us in blind and timid adherence to its successors, tradition should be positively discouraged. He makes it quite apparent and clear here that by tradition, by the use of the word tradition, he does not mean a blind and a weak adherence or an imitation of the works of earlier writers. I just to remind you, I have just said that this point I am making is connected with the idea that tradition is dynamic and not static. Had the tradition been static, then the work of every writer would have been to learn what the earlier writers have done and to copy it and repeat it. So for him, tradition is not repetition. Tradition is a matter of much wider significance. It cannot be inherited. And if you want it, you must obtain. Second point, next point, that literature, that tradition is acquired. It's acquired. How is it acquired? You need to develop a sense by making yourself acquainted with the work of the earlier writers. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense, which we may call nearly indispensable for every writer. This historical sense is indispensable for every writer. The historical sense involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. Then, the statement that I was referring to, or I was trying to come to, what is that? That it is a two-way process. When we think of the past and present, when we think of tradition and individual talent, okay, it is a two-way process. This is also how how we have to imagine the dynamism in tradition. That not only does the past shape the present, but it is in turn reshaped by the present. Every new work of literature which is genuinely new does not get shaped by that sense of, that historical sense, but it also reshapes the past. In what sense? Let us read. Whoever has approved this idea of order of the form of European or English literature, we will not find it preposterous that the past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. So this is what I was saying, that it is a two-way process. There is a reciprocity. Every genuinely new work of art alters the way we perceive literature. And every genuinely new work of art contains in it some of the vestiges of the earlier works. So in that sense, both tradition and individual talent are equally important. So in this second lecture on tradition and individual talent, we will explore
Good morning, sir.
further the meanings of tradition and individual talent as discussed by T.S. Eliot in his essay of the same name. In the first lecture, we discussed some basic ideas related to the notion or the concept of tradition. For T.S. Eliot, tradition can be understood as a sense of the past or a sense of continuity through which literature and arts have evolved. His second point was that as far as the English tradition of literature is concerned, there has been a disproportionate emphasis on the uniqueness of a particular piece of work or on the individual writers and their individualistic peculiarities as far as their writings were concerned. Then the next point was that in English literature, okay, the critical faculty has not been greatly developed. It is not. There is greater emphasis on creativity and lesser on the criticism part of literature. Now, let us read the second part of this essay and try and understand some very important aspects of this discussion. I will begin with this line in the fourth paragraph of this essay. No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation, is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead. So, what he means is that every artist has to be placed in the tradition of art and in the tradition of writing. This we have already discussed yesterday. Okay? We also, in our discussion yesterday, we also tried and defined tradition as a kind of a historical sense, because Eliot very clearly pointed out that tradition does not involve, or it does not consist of, following the ways of the immediate generation before us. What he means is that we cannot equate tradition with imitation or with repetition. Then he used the term historical sense. But in his exploration of this theme, in his analysis of the notion of tradition, we gradually understand that for Eliot, tradition is not repetition, it is not imitation, it is not the act of copying the earlier writers and trying to reproduce their art. It is a wrong way of understanding tradition. He uses the term historical. Tradition can be equated with historical sense, but tradition cannot be understood simply as a knowledge of the history of literature. This is a very important point, and all of us must clearly understand it, that whereas tradition is defined as a historical sense, it should not be understood to be simply an accumulated knowledge of the history of the development of arts and literature. Then what does he mean by tradition? For Eliot, tradition is a knowledge of the long-lived and established conventions of art as they get manifested in the standards set by the earlier writers, in the canons established by the earlier writers, in the methods and genres brought into existence by the earlier writer. So, here I will just refer to a line in this essay. I mean this as a principle of aesthetic, not merely historical criticism. Okay. So, we should remind ourselves here that by saying, just as we have said, that tradition, acquisition of tradition, does not simply mean the knowledge of history or historical knowledge. It is the knowledge of the conventions, the genres, the standards, the methods, okay, of writing that have, been developed over centuries, over ages. Okay? This is a static tradition and not simply history. Okay? Because we cannot, this point will become clear as we go ahead in the text, that it is, as far as art is concerned, it is wrong to draw a direct line between man's social, cultural experience and the creative expression, or man's social, cultural, economic experience and art. This fact and fiction, there is always a difference between them. There is a clear demarcation between fact and fiction. And T.S. Eliot also seems to be making an assertion that even though, as we said yesterday, art is part of our cultural life and it is a part of the collective response of human beings to their experiences, particularly their existential experiences. But we cannot draw a straight line between art and social existence. That would be a kind of a simplification, and it would not entirely be correct. Literature is always understood as a manifestation of man's creative impulses, also as a manifestation of man's existential problems. And that is why, okay, uh, we come to the second point here, that tradition should not be treated as a dead past. It is not a lump. It is not a bolus. It is not dead weight. There is this I discussed yesterday also, that as far as the past and the present are concerned, there is a reciprocity. It is a both the present affects the past as much as the past affects the present. Let us refer to a couple of lines here. Uh, yes, whoever has approved the idea of order of the form of European or English literature will not find it preposterous that the past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. So, just to repeat what I said in the last lecture, that he conceives of tradition not as something static, but as something dynamic, okay, as something living. Okay? That is why he says that uh, tradition is not static. It is not a dead weight. It should not be taken as a bolus, or as a lump. Okay? Uh, Past is affected by the present as much as the present is affected by the past. And why is this so? Let us come to the next point. First, I will read a few lines from the text. To proceed to a more intelligible exposition of the relation of the poet to the past, he can neither take the past as a lump, an indiscriminate bolus, nor can he form himself wholly on one or two private admirations, nor can he form himself wholly upon one preferred period. All these three approaches to the past or to the tradition. Past is not a lump, it is not something dead. Secondly, past does not consist of taking a selective approach and following some poets who may have been more famous than the others, nor is past an adherence to the conventions of a particular period. as far as a correct approach to tradition is concerned, okay, we have to demolish the differences between those writers who wrote uh, very long back and those who wrote recently. Similarly, we have to demolish the distinction between those writers who were popular and those who were not popular. Why this is so? This is so because art does not follow an evolutionary course. Okay? Art cannot, the progress of art cannot be equated with the economic growth or the material progress of the society. Art is related with the question of human existence and human life. Okay? We cannot say that art progresses from less perfect conditions to greater standards of perfection because, as I have said, it is a question of existence, it is a question of human life, and these questions may have troubled or must have troubled the earliest human beings as they trouble us today. So, this an approach to tradition or to the past in which we believe that uh, the the art that was produced in the early stages of human life was less refined, and we progress towards greater and greater refinement as we progress in life is wrong. Okay? That kind of a approach is wrong, and this idea is integral to his conception of past, and it gets expressed in a very revealing line which I am going to read for you now. Someone said, the dead writers are remote from us because we know so much more than they did. Precisely, and they are that which we know. Okay? It is when we say that the writers who wrote in the early stages of human life were ignorant, okay, as compared to us, okay, uh, and we possess greater knowledge. Okay. Our knowledge basically consists of, okay, the writers who wrote in the past. Okay. We cannot eliminate them. They are the part and parcel, they form the material of our knowledge. And more importantly, as I have said, it is not a question of some mechanical progress. It is not a question of social progress. It is a question of human life. And human life, more or less, in many of its aspects, has been the same. Man has been troubled by the questions of life and death right from the early stages, from the beginning of life. Now, the last part is related to a very peculiar problem of the learning and art. Okay. The objection, he says that there is often an objection is made that his uh, theory of poetry requires a ridiculous amount of erudition, learning. Okay? And it is also true that it will even be affirmed that much learning deadens or perverts poetic sense. Okay? Too much pedantry, too much pretentious show of your learning when you are writing makes a piece of art monotonous. So, where do we reconcile? Okay? On one hand, he advocates knowledge of tradition also entails that a poet should be a learned person, and poet's learning must get reflected in the in his works or in his or her poetry. So this leads to two problems. One is that his theory of poetry, his notion of tradition entails that a poet should be a learned person. Secondly, we also know that too much pedantry or too much show of one's knowledge makes the message or makes a work monotonous. So, T.S. Eliot makes it clear towards the end of the first section that by the need, okay, by the uh, uh, by his statement that we need to acquire the knowledge of the aesthetic traditions and conventions, okay, as they have been developed in the past by all writers, whether major or minor. Okay? He does not mean a mechanical approach to the acquisition of knowledge. Rather, what he proposes is an engagement with the past. Okay? Not a mechanical approach to an acquisition of knowledge related with the writers of the past, but an engagement. Now, this he makes clear with the help of an example. He says that Shakespeare acquired more essential history from Plutarch than most men could from the whole British Museum. What is to be insisted upon is that the poet must develop or procure the consciousness of the past, and that he should continue to develop this consciousness throughout his career. So, what he desires and proposes is an engagement with the living past, and past, every new work of art alters the past as much as the past determines the literature of the present. Okay, so let us take a few things related to the section 2 of tradition and individual talent. Till now, as far as section 1 was concerned, we have discussed a few very important things. One is that tradition and individual talent are equally important. But as far as the English tradition of literature is concerned, there has been a disproportionate attention on the poet's personality. Poetry has been interpreted in relation to the personality and the personal experiences of the writer. According to Eliot, this appears to be a deficiency in the English system of criticism. Then he affirms the importance of tradition in the process of writing poetry. Every good poet should acquire a sense of tradition, which means he should have a sound knowledge of all the established conventions of literature, which have been established in poetry through various ages during which poetry has been uh, written. After this, he went on to say that tradition cannot be equated with history. Tradition is related more with the aesthetic understanding of poetry through various ages during which poetry has been written, and it is not simply a mechanical memorization of the poems and the poets who have produced works in the past. This can be related, as I said earlier, with a simple thing that right from the beginning of life, fact and fiction have been different. T.S. Eliot maintains that the distinction between fact and fiction is very important. Poetry is definitely not factual. It is a part of fiction. It is a part of creativity. Therefore, the knowledge of tradition is actually the understanding of the aesthetics, the aesthetic conventions, the aesthetic methods, genres which have been used. It is very important to acquire these in order to become a poet. Okay? Poetry is not something that flows out of a man's experiences, a man's personality. Okay? Tradition is also important. you need to have a good understanding of the methods, of the genres, of the conventions which have evolved over time. Poetry, just like, as I have just to repeat myself, like other aspects of cultural experience, is a collective response to the existence of man on this earth. Okay? It is not something entirely individual. Okay? To put it in a better way, we should say that individual experiences as well as the knowledge of traditions, they are equally important when poetry is written. Thereafter, T.S. Eliot argued that uh, tradition should not be treated as a lump or a bolus, by which he means that tradition is dynamic, it is not static. And the last point that we made was that past and present affect each other in a two-way process, not a one-way process. Every new piece of poetry changes our conception and our perception of poetry to a great extent. Every novel work, every novel piece of writing, every new piece of literature has an equal potential of altering the past as the past has the potential of determining the present. So these were, in a nutshell, the points that we discussed till today. Today, as I said, we will be taking up section 2, in which he develops his ideas related to the theory of depersonalization. See, there is a very clear distinction between a personal approach to poetry and an impersonal approach to poetry. T.S. Eliot's ideas are marked by a very practical, objective approach to poetry and not a subjective approach to poetry. This is, I think, an attribute which is linked with his status as a modern poet. Okay? Somebody who was writing during the times when modernity was being introduced in arts, and there was a reformulation of ideas, okay, related to poetry. So he marks a very important turning point in the field of poetry. So here, just to strengthen his case, just to strengthen his argument that poetry should have more objectivity. Okay? It is something which is linked with depersonalization. He decides to elaborate his ideas with the help of an analogy from chemistry, okay, where he says that I shall therefore invite you to consider as a suggestive analogy the action that takes place when a bit of finely filiated platinum is introduced into a chamber containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide. So see, there is a link between the method he uses to explain his point and his point. Okay? The point is that there should be objectivity in writings, that it is an impersonal process. Okay? Depersonalization is very important when we write poetry, and he decides to. Okay? So there is a correspondence between the method and his point. Okay? He decides to illustrate his point with the help of a chemical experiment where oxygen and sulfur dioxide react in the presence of a filament of platinum. Okay? Platinum here is a catalyst, and he will explain the function of a poet with the help of this experiment. Honest and sensitive appreciation is directed not upon the poet but upon the poetry. So he begins his point by making a very, very important assertion. The assertion is that there is need to turn our attention away from the poet and towards poetry. Okay? So he begins with this. He says that generally in all criticism, and in all forms of analysis of poetry, there is a very strong tendency to uh, to valorize poets, to attach very great value to the reputation of various poets. So the quality of the poetry is more dependent on the reputation of a poet rather than being the other way round, rather than reputations being built because the poetry is good. So he has an objection to this. So, and his entire endeavor is to revise the notion, the concept of poetry, okay, on these lines. Okay. So let me read another very important line from the text. Uh, in the last article, I tried to point out the importance of the relation of the poem to other poems by other authors and suggested the conception of poetry as a living whole of all the poetry that has ever been written. So here there is a reiteration, okay, of an earlier point that uh, every poem that has been written right from the beginning, when poetry began to be written, constitutes a whole. It is a whole. Okay? We cannot uh, we cannot adopt a selective approach to poetry. It is a every piece of poetry is part of the continuous process of creativity, which has shaped literature, which has given definite contours to what we call poetry. So from this, we receive a suggestion that poetry or the evolution of poetry is not the work of individuals, it is the work of all the people put together who have indulged in creativity in one way or the other. Then he says that I hinted at, and I hinted by an analogy that the mind of a mature poet uh, differs from that of the immature one, okay, in the fact that an immature poet is a source, whereas a mature poet is a medium. So T.S. Eliot himself wrote as a medium, not as a source. Just to give you an example, he says a bad poet is a treats himself, looks at himself as the source of poetry, whereas a good poet looks at himself as a medium of poetry. Okay? And then he further elaborates what he means by this distinction between the medium and the source through the analogy we have just referred to. That analogy was that of the catalyst. When the two gases previously mentioned are mixed, that means when oxygen and sulfur dioxide react with each other, uh, in the presence of a filament of platinum, they form sulfurous acid. So this is the chemical reaction, okay, through the help of which he wants to develop his concept of depersonalization. He says when sulfur dioxide and oxygen react with each other in the presence of platinum, sulfurous acid is produced. The combination takes place only if the platinum is present. Nevertheless, the newly formed acid contains no trace of platinum. So there are two things which happen. Sulfurous acid is produced when sulfur dioxide and oxygen react with each other. Sulfurous acid is produced only when the reaction takes place in the presence of a filament of platinum. But more importantly, the platinum itself leaves no trace of itself in sulfurous acid. There is no trace of platinum. It does not affect the, the outcome, okay, of the reaction. okay, which remains, the outcome remains inert, neutral, and unchanged. The transposition of these ideas to poetry would definitely lead to an understanding that based on this, we have to treat the poet as a medium, not as a source. Okay? And a good poet is one, okay, who does not allow too much of his personality, his subjectivity, his personal experiences overshadow the works he produces. Okay? Uh, and this is beautifully described here in the line. The more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates. The more perfectly will the mind digest and transmute the passions which are its material. So there are two key terms. One, poet is a medium. Second, he is a instrument of transmutation, not an instrument of creation. Okay. So, in that sense, a poet is not a gifted person. A poet is not unique in his capacity as a writer of poems. Okay. He is not somebody extraordinary. Okay. He is only someone who registers the experiences of life, okay, which present themselves to him in the form of emotions and feelings, which are abstract. And these emotions and feelings are given the shape of words and images, okay, uh, in various combinations by the poet. This is his work. Okay? This precisely is his work. The experience, you will notice, uh, the elements which enter the presence of transforming catalyst are of two kinds, emotions and feelings. If we, as I said, transpose these ideas in poetry, we will say that just as uh, sulfur dioxide and oxygen react with each other, similarly, uh, the emotions and feelings, they are the raw material with which, or which react, or which combine in various uh, combinations, okay, in the mind of the poet is the catalyst. So uh, his work is, as I said, to to take feelings and emotions as his raw material, which are abstract. Okay? Feelings and emotions are abstract, and it is the work of the poet to transmute these feelings and emotions and give them a concrete shape in the form of images and words. Okay? But this is easier said than done because it is not a mechanical process. Okay? It is not a mechanical process. A lot of tradition, knowledge of tradition, is required to actuate this process. Okay? Because one does not become a poet if we follow his ideas and his logic. We can say that one does not become a poet by birth. It is through the reading of poetry, through learning how these activities, the creative process takes place. So the poet's mind is in fact a receptacle which can unite to form a new compound. Sorry, I am repeating. The poet's mind is in fact a receptacle for seizing and storing up numberless feelings, phrases, images, which remain there until all the particles can unite to form a new compound are present together. So it is not simply a very mechanical, okay, process of combining feelings and emotions and giving them there is some uh, something more to it also. So he says the poet's mind is in fact a receptacle for seizing and storing of numberless feelings, phrases, images, which remain there until all the particles which can unite to form a new compound. So definitely some serendipity is also important. Okay? He is not rejecting the idea that a poet is, after all, a talented person. Okay? So there is some individuality, some training in tradition, some serendipity, some understanding that the poet is not a source but a medium, which would make one a good poet. So poet's main job is finding appropriate images for feelings and the right combinations in which feelings and images, okay, can be mixed and blended to produce poems. Okay? So these ideas are then, there in his notion of objective correlative also, which I suggest all of you must read about in your glossaries of literary terms. Okay? And then in the next part, because I have just suggested that for him, poet is not a genius, we should simply say. Okay? So he rejects the idea of the sublime, either in poetry or in connection with our perspective about the poet. So if you compare several representative passages of the greatest poetry, you see how great is the variety of types of combinations, and also how completely and semi-ethical, any semi-ethical criterion of sublimity misses the mark. For it is not greatness, it is not the greatness of the person, but the intensity of the process which is important. Okay? The intensity of the process of writing, not a pre-existing a priori greatness of the person who is the poet. Okay? It is the more intense the process of writing, the better, the more intensity you put into the perception of ideas, the perception of feelings and emotions, and then searching for images, searching for the appropriate words to mix them in the most effective way. That is what, for him, constitutes poetry. So, finally, somewhere in the middle of this section, the difference between art and the event is always absolute. You cannot simply create overlaps of personal experience and poetry. Okay? That is disapproved of here. So there is difference between art and the event is always absolute. The combination, which is the murder of Agamemnon, is probably as complex as that which is the voyage of Ulysses. And then he elaborates this with the help of a poem which all of us have read. In either case, there has been a fusion of elements. The Ode of Keats contains a number of feelings which have nothing particular to do with the nightingale. Ode to the Nightingale is a poem in which so many things felt by the poet about life, about death, about the transience of life, okay, about so many insecurities that plague the mind of a man. They are all expressed through one symbol. The symbol is the nightingale, which the nightingale, I am repeating this line again, the Ode of Keats contains a number of feelings which have nothing particular to do with the nightingale, but which the nightingale partly, perhaps because of its attractive name, because of its associations, and partly because of its reputation, served to bring